And a special investigation on the front page of the Sunday Times is revealing how vulnerable the UK is to ballistic missiles. Its author is Harry Yorke, the paper's deputy political editor. Harry, good morning.
Good morning, Peter.
This is really quite worrying in terms of how open we are and indeed could be as time goes on to ballistic missile attacks. What should Keir Starmer do about it, according to NATO allies? And I would imagine as well, of course, as you've detailed, many figures within the defence community here in the UK as well.
Well, look, I think the broad consensus from everybody that I've spoken to, and as we say in the piece, we spoke to more than a dozen serving military personnel, former defence politicians, and defence experts for this piece, and that all of them are of the view that the UK has significant holes in its defences, and it must now invest significantly to plug those holes. On top of that, we understand that Lord Robertson, who is the former head of NATO and former defence secretary, and General Barrons, both of whom are leading the government strategic defence review, during their evidence gathering process, we understand that they have become increasingly concerned too. And therefore, their review, when it's published later this year, is likely to recommend this investment. So it seems that the pressure is all going one way, and that's to increase it more. And the reason why we have these gaps in air defences compared to other countries was actually kind of articulated publicly back in November by the Chief Air Marshal, the head of the RAF, Sir Richard Knighton. And he said that basically what had happened is since the Cold War, Britain had been enjoying a peace dividend. And we had just decided that the threat to us wasn't there from these long range missiles, because the conventional wisdom during the Cold War was that in the event that Britain was going to be attacked by a ballistic missile, that missile would have had a nuclear warhead on it. And what we would be talking about there is the beginning of World War III and nuclear war. So the reason why they were confident that that wouldn't happen is because we now have a nuclear deterrent and have had for decades, and therefore it would have ensured mutually assured destruction. But what we are now seeing play out across the world, Peter, is the proliferation of increasingly complex, long range, incredibly fast moving ballistic missiles which could be used below the threshold for nuclear war. So these would be weapons without nuclear warheads on them, but could still pose a significant threat to Britain. They could strike critical national infrastructure, some of our key military assets overseas. And we seem to be very, very under-equipped to deal with that. We currently have a fleet of Type 45 destroyers, and we have six of those. But there are only two of them normally at any given time that are operational and at sea, with two more in port receiving maintenance and another two at low readiness. And what that means is we've got two ships to try and guard all of our assets across the globe. And that seems a big stretch. So yeah, the big focus of people across the armed forces, NATO allies, is that we start to significantly invest in the types of systems that could defend against these missiles.
Investment is money, though, of course, and we know that £3 billion a year is going to Ukraine. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, said in her budget that that will continue for, as she put it, as long as is necessary. Is there a sense that perhaps money that should be going to defence in this country is perhaps going abroad? And I wonder if that is the case, or even if it isn't, where this money might come from. It's a big political problem, but it's an economic problem as well if you're going to get our spending on defence up to what NATO wants it to be.
There is no doubt at all, Peter, that we are dealing with a difficult situation here. We're dealing with probably the most acute threat to Britain from these types of missiles in the last 30 years, at the same time that we have incredibly strained public finances. In answer to your question about money going overseas, there were definitely a number of people I spoke to who were concerned that when this review completes later this year, we're expecting that the government will finally set out a timeline for hitting 2.5% defence spending, and say when that's going to happen. But the risk is that the government will include in that figure the money that we have long-term committed to Ukraine. Some people would like that to be stripped from the figures and for the Ukraine to be treated as a separate entity, because what we're doing and what we've done admirably is we've donated billions of pounds of military kit to Ukraine since the war began. But that is obviously not protecting, that is protecting us in the long term. It's defending against Russian aggression in Europe. But what it is not doing is filling the gaps in our own security should we ever risk being attacked. So
Yeah.
there is definitely a call for us to strip those two things out and treat them as two different issues. And the other thing I would say is what was quite shocking and a number of sources mentioned to me is I think this is a figure that's doing the rounds actually internally in the Ministry of Defence is that when you strip out the nuclear deterrent from our defence spending, which is currently 2.3% of GDP, we actually only spend about 1.6% on conventional defence. And given all of the new upgrades that we need across the armed forces, not just for air defence and missile defence, but for all of our equipment plans, that is not enough money to sustain all of the upgrades, which means that unless we significantly increase defense spending, then there is inevitably going to be some quite significant cuts to key defense programs in the coming years. And when we're
Yeah.
at such a high risk, people are starting to question whether we can really afford to do that.
And it's interesting, you and your co-author, George Grills, the defence and political correspondent, actually, you're writing a lot, I suppose, about the hardware aspect of this. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the digital aspect, the fact that, of course, we've had a number of cyber attacks from China and Russia at various points. Is there a sense that conventional warfare is changing to asymmetrical warfare, and actually maybe the hardware and having frigates and so on maybe isn't the direction we should go in, even though there is this huge threat, may well be a very growing threat, from ballistic missiles?
Well, it's funny you mention that, Peter. I think that was the assumption until 2022. People may remember that Boris Johnson, when he was Prime Minister, was asked about the cuts to the army's tanks. And his response was, well, we're never going to. Basically, he was quite dismissive of the prospect of a conventional land battle where the army would be required to field large numbers of tanks again. And then, guess what? A few months later, Russia invaded Ukraine, the first European invasion since the Second World War, and we've seen just how important that conventional capability has been. And look at what some of our allies who are closer to that threat, the Poles, for example, they have thousands of tanks and they have donated hundreds of them to Ukraine to try and bolster its capabilities against Russia. So it's definitely true that that kind of grey warfare is being prosecuted against the West by Putin. He is using cyber, the Chinese are using cyber, and we have to also step up in those areas. But this is the entire problem, is that by focusing potentially on the future threats, we have maybe taken our eyes off the ball on the conventional threats, and they are still there. And they are in fact again growing. So it's a very challenging picture. It's going to require investment across the board. You can't just focus on air and missile defense going forward and then neglect those other capabilities that you've just mentioned. But so look, I don't say it's an easy task for the government, but somehow they have to try and navigate it.
Harry, thank you very much indeed. Harry Yorke, the Sunday Times Deputy Political Editor, along with George Grills, the Defence and Political Correspondent, have written that Splash, that main article, front page of the Sunday Times today. Of course, if you have a digital subscription, you can read it as well. Very, very interesting, talking about calls to significantly increase spending on air and missile defence. That Sunday Times investigation revealing Britain increasingly vulnerable to ballistic missile attacks.